Welcome to Science Gallery Bengaluru's exhibition season Psyche. For those of you who are new here, Science Gallery Bengaluru is a public institution for research-based engagement. Psyche is our fifth exhibition season and the third that is completely digital and online. Psyche has been a season that has explored the complexities of the human mind. Before I get into today's very exciting discussion, I'd like to tell you a bit more about the upcoming programs as we wait for participants to join. Later this evening, we have a lecture by neurobiologist Samir Zeki talking about neuroaesthetics and the neurobiology of beauty. This is at 6:30 p.m. today evening. Do join us also tomorrow for a discussion between filmmaker Mutiganda Van Mukunda, lawyer Alice Bullard, and global health researcher Injonge Karangwa to discuss Muti's film Claire X Bosco. This is tomorrow at 4:30 p.m. in the evening. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's discussants who will be discussing quantifying subjective humanness through the McGill Pain Questionnaire. First, the artist Eugenie Lee, whose work is exhibited in Psyche. Eugenie is a Korean-Australian artist with a conceptual focus on persistent pain. She investigates pain-related perceptions and experiences through various media and technologies that often stem from collaborations with pain scientists and researchers, which includes installations, paintings, and participative interactive performances. Her notable curatorial exhibitions include the Big Anxiety Festival, Modify, It's Not What You Know, and The Patient, the medical subject in contemporary art. Eugenie is a recipient of major grants and residency awards in Australia and graduated with honors from Sydney College of Arts in Australia 2012. Our next discussant is Mick Thacker, who is a professor of pain, physiotherapy, and rehabilitation at the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland. He is renowned in the field of pain research and management and has a unique background as a clinician, neuroscientist, and philosopher. He has conducted numerous research projects spanning bench to bedside and is motivated to understand pain and those who experience it as fully as possible. He currently focuses on a predictive processing framework to understand pain. He has previously been involved in several dance projects with a focus on pain and its expression in those with their own living experiences. Last but not least, Sanya Martek is a UK-based osteopath with special interest in persistent pain. She currently works in the Lincolnshire Community Pain Management Service as a senior pain clinician, where she has the privilege to accompany people who experience persistent pain. Sanya has a background in comparative literature and is forever fascinated in the intersection of medical humanities, especially narrative medicine and healthcare. Sanya is passionate about introducing and promoting medical humanities, especially narrative medicine, in undergraduate healthcare education, and therefore promoting critical thinking and structural competency through the use of art. Now that we have such a diverse group of discussants with us today afternoon, I'd also like to remind our participants that there will be an interactive Q&A session at the end of the discussion. So please add your questions as they come to you in the Q&A box. The participants will be very happy to discuss it at the end. We will also be sharing a feedback form link with you. So do share your thoughts about today's program, the exhibition, as well as what you'd like to see from Science Gallery Bengaluru going forward. Now, without further ado, I'll hand over to Eugenie to start today's session.
Thank you very much, Madhusri. Hello, everyone. I'm joining you from Wongaland, Eora Nation, where some people also call Sydney, Australia. And I'm very grateful that you chosen this hour to join our talk today. So today we're going to talk about medical system relating to the current exhibition, my installation called McGill Pain Questionnaire. But before I begin, I would like Mick to talk about what McGill Pain Questionnaire is. Mick.
Hi, thank you, Eugenie, and lovely to join everyone, and real privilege to be able to speak with two of my good friends and learned colleagues. So, and we hope you have a really interesting and entertaining time. this afternoon with us. So the McGill Pain Questionnaire really dates back to the sort of late 60s and mid 70s. It was developed by Professor Ron Malzak, who I had the privilege and pleasure of getting to know reasonably well. And Ron was a psychologist, clinical psychologist, and also a neuroscientist who was educated at McGill University in Canada, and then went to work at MIT in the States, where he formed a collaborative group with another good friend, mentor of mine, Professor Pat Wall. And together in the late sort of 60s, mid-late 60s, they developed an idea called the pain gate theory, which many of you dropping in today may be well versed with. From that, they started to really have the idea that the pain was this very complex, multi-dimensional experience that people have. And together they started the idea that they might like to collect words. And they put themselves into lots of different situations. So they both volunteered to be in field hospitals during conflicts across the globe, and listen to the type of words that soldiers and civilians who had been injured started to use. And then they went into pain clinics in major sort of hospitals to try and listen to what was actually being expressed in terms of the experience that people were having. And that really led Ron Malzak in particular to develop this sort of idea around words. And in the original sort of version, there were 108 adjectives that Ron had put together in actually a very free form, and then tested out in various clinics to see what words people preferred, didn't prefer, and slowly developed what we now recognize as the long form of the McGill Pain Questionnaire. There are now 3 forms of the questionnaire in existence. The long form that I think sadly people don't use anymore, because I think it actually, compared to the other 2 groups, it probably allows a greater freedom of people to express the words that they would choose. But also there's a short form and then a second version of the short form. Basically, the long version had several groups of words split into certain orders to cover what Ron Malzak was particularly interested in, is these ideas of 3 dimensions of pain. So Ron Malzak thought there were 3 dimensions of pain. And thank you, Eugenie's putting up a version of it. Yeah,
this is the original, just the one sheet paper. I thought it might be better for audience just to have a look exactly what you mean by it.
Yeah, and what we can do is we can throw some links up so that we can put versions of the forms up for you. But Ron Malzak thought that if you wanted to understand pain, you needed to understand that there are probably 3 dimensions, and he described them as sensory discriminative. So the best way to sort of give you an example of that, if you all sat in front of your computers and pulled a hair on your arm, if you have one, and just plucked at it, you would probably know that you were doing something to yourself, and that would be a sensation. And you would locate where you're exactly on your arm you're putting it on by discriminating where exactly in your limb that was. So he described this as 1 dimension, and many of us would obviously find that very intuitive to understand, and we can do a simple experiment to demonstrate it. The second and perhaps more complex dimension was this affective motivational. So affect is another word for emotion. And in Ron's idea, particularly as a psychologist, he thought that motivation drives behaviors, as many psychologists do. And there were words that people would use to try and describe the emotional aspect and the emotional dimension of having a pain experience. And then the third dimension was a cognitive evaluative, if you like, thoughts, feelings, trying to make sense of actually an experience. And what Ron then did is he took those 3 dimensions and listed the words that he and Pat and other people had heard patients say, and tried to bring those into the sort of structure that Eugenie very kindly showed on the screen, into sort of words. So in the original form, it had 10 groups of words that related to the sensory discriminative, 5 groups of words that related to the affective motivational, and 1 group of words that are related to the cognitive evaluative. And in that order, in those each group, there was an order of words with increasing, if you like, intensity, and they would be scored from 1 to, I think the greatest sort of group of words includes 6 words, so 1 to 6 on a sort of intensity scale. So that was allowing people to make sense and to try and give a quantitative measure, a score that could be used to compare, if you like, the intervention or treatment. So you could give the McGill Pain Questionnaire at the beginning of an intervention, and then at the end, and you hope that the total score decreased. So the higher the score basically indicates the greater experience of pain. Now, there are a few issues with that. Whilst I think it was a brilliant tool, we now understand that there are some limitations. It was developed obviously at McGill, which is actually a French-speaking, university, but also English. But it has a very European slant to it. The words are particularly white European focused. And if you wanted to go further, they're particularly Judeo-Christian related words. So if you come from a culture where that isn't necessarily the domination of your language type, then that might not stand up, although the questionnaire has been translated, I think, now into something like 56 different languages. Not all of those translations have actually been fully validated, but it is widely used. And the other thing that we've sort of discovered about it is actually one of the issues is around this thing called co-localization of words. That is, the words that generally go together. So if you were to think about pain, because that's why people are given the questionnaire to use, there are words that you associate more easily with the word pain in your own language than other words. And that produces a bias towards those words. And that's perhaps now realized as one of the major problems with the McGill Pain Questionnaire. Still hugely and widely used. And we think, in certain situations, it should be used, but there are issues with it. And perhaps we're going to go on to discuss some of those issues and some of our own concerns and criticisms of the McGill Pain Questionnaire. But the important thing is it's set and continued to lead an all new world when it came to trying to understand pain. And one of the great things about it is it tried to understand the person who was experiencing pain. And that is really very important. And whether we still support its use or not, it was revolutionary at that point of time when it was first developed.
Well, that was actually a really interesting way to hear about McGill Pain Questionnaire from a scientist's perspective, especially you knew Ron Malzak and those people who are involved creating this work. For me, I came across this questionnaire at uni library many years ago while I was looking for some artwork to produce. And when I came across this questionnaire, I was initially incredibly grateful and ecstatic. The reason being is that up till that point, I was looking for ways for somebody or something to validate my pain experience. So for some of you who don't know me, I live with persistent pelvic pain, and I've been living with pelvic pain for over 2 decades now, plus some other pain issues, which I will not go through today. But I think a lot of people who live with pain would agree with me that it's really hard to be validated from people, whoever we talk to. It's hard for other people to understand or even to believe that what I say, it feels like a certain way. So when I came across this, I was just so happy. I thought, finally, a medical science, there is something that would acknowledge my emotional subjective experience of pain rather than seeing me as some sort of biomechanical machine. So I wanted to create an artwork about this work in combination of my own experience as a self-portrait installation, and I wanted to find out what the artwork would look like. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my installation, where Science Gallery in Bengaluru has amazingly recreated my installation digitally, which I'm just so just so amazed about. So my initial installation, physical space, it was done in a form of twin white filing cabinet to represent the ways in which medical systems observe, measure, and attempt to categorize patients' human subjective experience. The cabinets facing each other are like a surrogate for the pained body and psyche living within seemingly perfectly functioning facade of a person. So when you look at a person, you will never know whether that person is in pain until you hear them talk about it or you see their body language in a certain way to communicate with someone else. So back to the installation. The filing cabinets, they are covered in monotonous drawers and labeled with, each drawers are labeled with adjectives drawn from the questionnaire itself. The symmetrical and uniformly organized facade of the filing cabinet contrasts with this overwhelming lack of control felt when a person begins to experience persistent pain, with this gradual realization that there may be no existing clear treatment options laid out for me. That itself is a devastatingly scary thought. So how do you measure pain, which encompasses all aspects of our lives on a piece of paper like the questionnaire with limited range of words? I mean, I think there's a link for you guys to click on, but if you look at it here on first category, you just got to pick only one word, and then you got to move on to the second category, and then you got to pick one word there as well. And I actually tried it a few times. And sometimes I just couldn't find the right words, but it's like you have to pick one in one category. And I'm thinking, but I don't feel any of those one in certain categories. and I don't associate with those words. And maybe also because I was born in Korea, learned to speak Korean as my first language, and learning English as my second language, maybe there's an even further distance for me to associate with certain words. So like many people living with long-term pain, I've struggled with sense of loss, existential crisis, and destroyed sense of agency. And how do you translate some of those experiences on a piece of paper with selected adjectives? And I know that I'm not placing this level of expectation from this questionnaire. And I now understand that there may be never be one that could measure all of it in a single questionnaire or a single procedure. But I am also aware of that current unbridgeable gap between the objective medicine and expressing through verbal communication from somebody who live with the pain. And this unbridgeable gap is always present. One of the reasons that I find there is this unbridgeable gap is because pain is invisible. Proving it even exists is difficult. It doesn't show up on a scan, and there's no hard evidence of its presence. Communicating about pain can be detrimentally problematic as it relies on the verbal accounts of a person who experiences it. But these accounts are not always believed. It is especially the case for those who are outside of this narrow standard model of white, slim, heterosexual, cis male. So how do we find our way around to deal with these barriers? When I created this installation, which was in 2012, I just simply wanted to be believed and wanted to have my say along the way. These were, so back to the installation. Amongst the cabinets, amongst the equal uniformed drawers, I've dotted across a few visual manifestations of my personal pain. So there are moving images, 3 moving images on one side, and there's a moving mechanism showing on the other side. Through them, I've tried to objectify the intangibility of my visual experiences and to make sense of my private agony, because I just couldn't verbally explain what I was experiencing. Although pain is invisible, these viewing windows are sort of like a medical scan for me. So every time I go and see my clinicians, they say, oh, nothing's showing up. And often they tend to hint that maybe it's a psychiatric complaint because there's nothing wrong with you. So I actually created evidence that my pain truly exists. It is my way of showing this is the scan that you can see. You wanted to see the evidence. This is like a hard evidence for you to see. Whilst creating this self-portrait installation, I was also deeply aware of the tension between the clinical system that's ultimately removed from its subject and the human experience that has a history that is built and formed through layers of social interactions, emotions, and memories of lived experience. And I wanted the viewers to reflect upon a sense of the individual being lost in medical discourse. Because pain is not exclusively confined to the sensory experience. It can't be presumed that all physical causes of persistent pain must be either be detectable or, if not, characterized as some sort of psychiatric issues that often, if a woman say, I feel this extreme pain around my pelvis, sometimes they say it's a hysteria, you're crazy. So to me, art became a safe space where I can store my thoughts and stories that I don't want to say out loud sometimes. But at the same time, they're all there in the open for others to see if they look or contemplate closely enough. So in a sense, art gives me this incredible platform with a beautiful dichotomy that it allows me to share my voice with people outwardly and courageously with a purpose, but also provides me with a private shelter to quietly reflect and grow in my own time. So that's just a small gist of what this artwork was about. Now I want to knock on Sanya's door now. Sanya, like hearing my story and Mick's explanation of McGill Pain Questionnaire from 2 very different perspectives. You as a clinician who see person who live with pain every day coming through your clinical practice, I want to hear your story, your perspective.
Thank you so much, Eugenie. And I just want to start by saying I'm very honored to be part of this project, and thank you for having me. I feel an enormous amount of responsibility in trying to answer this question, how we as clinicians encounter pain in clinical practice in the world around us. because I think there is so much that happens in that relational space in a clinical encounter, where clinicians come to know and see and hear and witness something that's beyond even the capacity to be communicated into verbal language. So in my attempt of trying to answer this question, I decided to share a little story to you that I wrote about one of my patients. It's a young woman who lives with fibromyalgia, who I have had a privilege of seeing in my clinic for a couple of months. This young woman was experiencing a lot of institutional and structural violence in terms of not being believed that she was experiencing what she was experiencing. And I wrote this on a train journey back to and from work, where I travel a lot around the county as a part of my job. And I guess I wrote this in order to come a little bit closer to her experience, trying to make sense of what it must feel like to be always looked at like something's kind of wrong with you, but at the same time being denied the very prerogative of being chronically ill. So I was trying to come to understand what does it feel like to be in her shoes, but also whilst also understanding that I will never understand, because that's impossible, and it's not my job as a clinician to fully master that. This young woman lived in poverty, and there was a transportation problem between where I was working and where she was living, and the connectivity with the bus was really poor. So we often had a problem of booking her for follow-up appointments, and she had to cancel some. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is to show that human experience of pain does not exist in some kind of empty space or a hollow vacuum. It actually exists in an environment that is rich in information, and that is also composed of structures and hierarchies that often have power to crush people's lives. And I also wanted to really show that these things cannot be measured with pain questionnaires, not with randomized controlled trials, that they really need to be witnessed. They need to have this, what I like to call ethnographic witness. And that witnessing needs a place of trust that needs to be earned as well. So I'm going to read out this whole story to you. It's called Indigo, Her Blue Eyes and the Black Box Full of Pain. I changed the name and fictionalized the story to protect the identity. I also want to say that not in a million years I thought I will be reading this story in front of them on an online exhibition, so please just bear with me. On the east coast of the UK, there is a county called Lonelyshire. Lonelyshire is famous for its farms and flat landscape upon which the vast blue sky stretches like the whales inside stretched over Port Jonah. There is a sense of surrender and long forgetting in the flatness of the landscape, the same one you find in people's sufferings. It's like the very land is telling you, live in silence, don't look up, don't question. Indigo didn't question much when her doctor told her that she's too young to have fibromyalgia. She believed him and wondered whether she was truly imagining the pain that walked all over her body and kept her awake at night. Indigo is 22 and she's from the East Coast. The easter you go, the sadder it gets. Indigo walked into my clinic just as her life was turning from bad to worse. 3 months ago, she fell down the stairs, and ever since she's been in horrendous pain. Indigo has deep blue eyes that carry the sadness that her words don't say. They don't look at me, those deep blue eyes. They look through me, piercing the heart of my soul. Indigo puts her pain in the black box and pretends it is not there. In one of our sessions, we attempt to open up the box by breaking a hole on the side. It is too heavy, the pain, she says. We cover up the hole. It is not time yet. Indigo works in the local grocery store, and she's just found out she's been made redundant. She's useless to them with all of her pain. She says they look at her when she's struggling to lift the heavy boxes. But she looks fine, they say. And she's also pretty. Can you be that pretty and still be in pain? I don't think so. Something else must be wrong with her. Indigo internalizes their words and stores the sadness in her deep blue eyes. The black box of pain gets heavier and heavier. Please don't send me back to X services. They make me feel worse, says Indigo. I'm curious as to why she would say that, so I look at the notes from the services, and every letter begins with, I reviewed Miss Swan today, and she looks fine again. I inhale deeply. What is the impact of not being valued and heard as a young person in pain? What is the impact of spending years trying to prove that you are disabled? What is the impact of the constant looks that keep telling you something's wrong with you while denying you the very prerogative of being ill at the same time? What is the impact of questioning your own sanity because of someone else's stupidity? How do you ever find a journey back to yourself after that? One last question, Indigo says, while leaving the room. When I push my trolley down the street and the people look at me like something's wrong with me, can you give me something for that? I could see her face just as I was reading the story. Thank you so much for listening.
I know, Sanya, you read that to me before, but second time around, it's just as powerful. I don't know whether the word powerful is the right one to say, but there are so many elements that I can resonate. So my question is, how do we move on from stories like that? I mean, I know we need science, and science by nature objectifies in order to, should I say, find the truth? I don't know. I'm not a scientist and I'm not a philosopher, so I can't. Is that right? Is that even right to ask, the right way to ask, Mick? And how do we quantify from stories like that? What do you think?
I mean, I think you're absolutely right that science describes itself as about wanting to find a truth, or at least to try and find out what's wrong, to leave more truthful things to then investigate, so that eventually we try to get to some point of truth. But I'm really pleased and delighted to say that actually most of the forward-thinking scientists, philosophers, clinicians within pain would listen to what your account and your description of your artwork, Eugenie, and your beautiful story, Sonia, that very much resonated with me as a person who grew up in that very landscape you're talking about, literally in that landscape you're talking about, and you're talking about people I observed growing up and motivated me to want to understand more about pain, you know. So that was the first time I've heard it, and it was, yeah, I think I want to use the word powerful and really important to hear. But I think that, you know, good modern science is now understanding that this objectification in search of the truth is probably a bit of a false prophecy or a false ideal, and that we need to actually combine in some way this sort of a first person approach that is part of the accounts you've both given, together with this sort of third person objectification sort of side of things that people like myself, when we go to certain parts of our work, go in to try and sort of control everything, define everything, follow a structure, a methodology to come out with essentially what I've said is, things which are false and things which remain after trying to prove whether they're true or false. But I'm glad to say that we're probably in this exciting arena where, forward-thinking people are able to incorporate the stories, the expression in terms of art, the visualization that you've given, Eugenie, into a better understanding of pain. And I think, to be fair to Malzahn, he's very definitely a man of his time. If we think about the socio-political, cultural sort of dominance within the mid sort of 70s, we hadn't even gone through neoliberalism at that point, So I think, yeah, I'm sure if Ron Malzahn was still alive and still being the forward-thinking person he was today, he might be coming up with something that wasn't the McGill Pain Questionnaire, but was able to incorporate the sort of beautiful accounts you've both given.
I mean, going back to, okay, so science objectifying the subjective experience of sentient being or whatever they may be studying. From my own experience, if I stayed as a patient's perspective, which was probably up till 2012 when I did this installation, I was still seeing clinicians, different world, patients, different world, and no other world existed. That's how I used to see things, black and white. But now, after doing my residencies and working with other pain researchers and having a lot of clinicians as my colleagues and friends, I'm seeing things differently now. Just as much as, patients complain about, clinicians, they don't see us as human beings and stuff, in my own way, I wasn't seeing them as human beings either when I think about it. So you're right. Being able to objectify, I think it is impossible, as it involves humans studying humans in this context of pain. Objective methodologies are still, because influenced by our or someone else's theoretical standpoints and biases. So of course they're bound to create problems one way or the other. And I'm just so glad, Mick, you said that, forward-thinking scientists and researchers are really definitely moving on towards the first-person perspective. But what does first-person perspective means from scientists, from their perspective?
Well, having praised scientists for moving on and being forward-thinking, actually, unfortunately, it often does still revolve around questionnaires for scientists, trying to objectify that. It still means, there's an whole group of questionnaires well away from the McGill Pain Questionnaire that are trying to get to the thoughts and the feelings of somebody. I think this is where clinicians, and I love Sonia's viewpoint on this, is, clinicians can talk to people and interact with people. They can hear the voice directly. Scientists can do that, but often choose not to. They still go back to some objectification. They believe they're trying to test out, this idea that it's in person's own sort of terminology. But they're often not. And this is where I think, the influence of philosophers and psychologists who are interested in this construct of phenomenology are really important. Again, there are people who've worked towards methodologies that try to objectify or increase the objective sort of accuracy of those approaches. And again, I hear myself as I talk about that, it's an internal tension between the scientist in me and then listening to this repeated use of the word objectify and trying to score and trying to quantify. I desperately support that and understand why that's important. But I've always struggled with that too when it comes to pay. with my clinical background, with my philosophical background, and but I think the first person is trying to get the very best account of someone's lived experience. Whether scientists are the best people or even attempting to do that is an open question, but I know that a lot of clinicians are excellent at doing it. And yeah, I perhaps Sonia, you could tell us how you go about that in clinical practice, how you try to get at that lived experience.
Yeah, I so agree with you that clinicians have a huge symbolic capital, and I think they have the social power to really advocate for these things. I also want to acknowledge that at the same time, as clinicians, as scientists, as patients, people living with pain, we all live within this kind of quite oppressive system that we should really name. It's a white supremacist, racial capitalist system we're all operating within. And traditionally, I think clinicians' role is seen like within the four walls of a clinical room. And I completely disagree with that. If one thing I've learned by traveling across the Lincolnshire in this vastness of space is that actually it made me re-question, where does my clinical space end? And I think as clinicians, I'm just conscious I'm using the word should, but I think we should be working upstream and really influence these structures of oppression through patient advocacy, through facilitating this integration of social system within the medical system, because again, traditionally they are completely separated, which doesn't really make much sense, because social conditions such as poverty and racism actually make us sick. So we really should be talking to each other. And also through advocating for trauma-informed care. And what I mean by this is actually proactive and systematic trauma-informed care that doesn't just see trauma as an event in somebody's life, but actually as a way of life, way of living for some people day by day. So I think as clinicians, we can really ask ourselves, how do we reimagine our role? I think I also want to acknowledge that the system within which we work, which is often bureaucratically encumbered and time pressed and really gets in the way, as you said, Eugene, seeing clinicians as humans, system really hurts us. It morally injures us by challenging our ability to do good care, a care we believe in. And then you end up having good clinicians leaving the system in order to survive, and that's completely understandable. But I do, I'm an idealist, and I do think that it's possible to make a change even within the system by, there is no manual how to do this, because this approach requires flexibility and creativity. But even just by starting a dialogue, by knocking on somebody's door, writing an email, doing a discussion, just asking those questions. As Audre Lorde said, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So we have to kind of use the non-master's tools, so think differently than the master. So if the master thrives on conquer and divide, then we need to be thinking in the language of empower and connect and build communities and speak up about these things. I think I a little bit tracked from the question, but I don't know. I do think that clinicians have a really huge, it's so powerful when your clinician is advocating for you. It's something so symbolically empowering about that, because as clinicians, we see where the cracks are in the system. We see where the problem is. We kind of, we see the truth, kind of. So it's really powerful to be acting from within.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that certainly I felt in various places I worked whilst I was a clinician is how disempowered I am, because actually, other people are setting many of those agendas, how many people I should see for how long, what I should do, what I'm allowed to do, scope of practice, those early days of trying to understand more that first person within the clinic, being told as a physical therapist, which is my clinical background, you know, similar to your own, Sonia, that we shouldn't play at being a psychologist. We shouldn't try to go anywhere near the way that people think and feel. You know, as a young clinician, being told that that was not in my remit, you know, it's out of my scope of practice. You know, trying to understand the person under that guise, you know, is criticized as actually being unprofessional. And that left a huge, not scar on me, because I've tried to do something in my own career, and I know you're doing that, and Eugenie's doing that in different ways, to try to make sure that that thing never returns, where people think trying to understand the person with the experience of pain, you know, should only fit within different disciplines and different remits for different clinical groups. Yeah.
So here is that major question. Let's reimagine a new future in this context of pain. What would that look like, and who needs to be involved? Clearly, it needs to be more than just a clinician, and maybe a pain scientist or something. Who else needs to be involved? I mean, I am so biased that I know artists needs to be involved. Because to me, there is, I mean, a lot of people who live with pain, they would agree with me. There's a room for improvement. And I'm sure both of you also agree with it, a room for improvement. And what do we need to improve? From my perspective, there is room for art to fill in some of the gaps alongside the science and clinical practice in a real life situation, as an alternative storytelling platform. I mean, people sort of may think the storytelling platform from a scientist perspective, that's just unnecessary, but it is necessary because we're talking about real life story here, like a real life situation. Story is the one that binds all of us together. Story is the one that connects people to be able to communicate through stories. And so in allowing the person to create meaningful relevance and connection with what is essentially an abstract concept. I mean, art is abstract, pain perception is abstract. So of course, those two, to me, they go so well together. I mean, pain and art, like with this common ground they're sharing, they both benefit from using metaphorical, visual, or experiential forms to better communicate and share this concept with each other, because communication is a real problem at the moment, and art is an excellent communicative tool. And I'm not talking about like art therapy. I mean, there's a place for art therapy too, but I don't know. I don't really understand art therapy, so I can't speak for them. But art in itself, it deserves a space there, because art can become an opportunity. It's an educational tool if we choose to use it as an educational tool, and it's a safe space for reflection, contemplation, for social space, and in a way that, because it can become like a social engagement tool or space, art in itself, in its own existence, it's meaningless without the audience or participants or somebody who uses art. I mean, people say art is an elitist. Some people don't want to go near it, but to me, art can never be elitist. It's there for people. Art is subjective, emotional, it's forgiving. It reaches and connects people to see everyone as we, not I, but we, it creates community with a perspective of equal humanity. So I am severely biased when it comes to art. So yes, art needs to come in. Clinicians, of course, pain scientists, philosophers. Who else do we need to move forward towards this reimagination?
I mean, I think the obvious statement is, and obviously it's different because it's you voicing that, Eugenie. So you have been the patient. You are, in a sense, the patient. But I think we need to explicitly say we need the person with the experience of it.
Of
You
course,
know, I think that's integral to what you're expressing there. But yeah, we do, and I'm glad to say again back to that sort of what is science doing to mitigate this. You know, you won't get grants in most countries now unless you involve the patient group, the people about which you're doing the research, to get their impression, you know, public sort of engagement. And that's a fantastic thing. But more specifically to what you've said, and to highlight the power of your visual art, Eugenie, and your verbal art, Sonia, is, yeah, maybe what we do is we just need to tear up the system. What about if we said to anyone coming for an appointment in a pain clinic, or any clinic, but specifically a pain clinic for pain, can you bring me your own depiction, your chosen depiction of your pain? Can you produce that before you come? It could be a drawing, it could be written work, it could be whatever. It could be a story you just want to verbalize to me. Because, you know, I'm struck, you know, there's certain things while you were talking that really came out for me. Is if you, Eugenie, don't mind, putting up the McGill again for us quickly. Could you show that? And because on there is a body chart, there's this mannequin, as you can see, and classically when that's been used, clinicians ask the patient and draw on it themselves. The clinician does the drawing. Whenever I've used this, and still if I ever use a body chart, I get the person to draw it and then to talk me through what they've drawn. So, you know, I'm doing it when they're with me, but there's no reason they couldn't draw you know, their experience before they come, or write a story, or just do it in a verbal language. And I think Malzacker was sort of had that thought himself a little bit when he put that together. But again, you very kindly, Eugenie, and rightly acknowledge the people on which land you now live. That culture only communicated through stories and visual means. You know, it's one of the oldest, you know, original man and woman in Australia. That is their chosen medium of communication. Verbal storytelling, artistic storytelling, you know, which maybe, do we go back to the future to get to the future? Do we go back to how human beings communicated for millennia before we thought that that wasn't the right way to go, and we started to impose all of this sort of systematic thinking, you know? And again, to your point, Sonia, you know, capitalism most definitely done that in many different domains, and capitalism dominates within healthcare across the world, you know, whether it's for profit or a value-based system, you know, it's still got a capitalistic sort of tendency towards it. But I think we need to go, oh, shut up, it's back to the future. I think that we need to engage with those very expressive ways that people communicate, to really understand something like pain better in the clinic. And then we can use some of that within sort of, you know, science to ask better questions, and philosophy will help us to ask better questions. I'm shutting up.
But do you think, Mick and Sanya, do you think the way you think and how your ethics and communicating with patients, do you think you two are rare breeds? I mean, for you to be that open with people walking into your clinics per se, because I haven't actually seen that many clinicians who be that open if I actually walk in with a drawing or something. And I really I would love to see a lot of clinicians being that open-minded, but to lead to that point, to lead for that to become the norm, what do we need?
I'm just gonna say, I don't see myself as a precious. I don't think I'm a rare breed. When I speak to my colleagues, we are definitely on the same page. People do see people. It's the system that's the problem. I just think we need to be speaking out loud more. We actually need to make a noise. And I think now is a really good time to make a noise when we're living in this really historical moment with all these crises happening. And I think COVID-19 crisis has really almost beautifully showed us in which kind of society we're living in, with the climate injustice and racial injustice and public health crises and COVID-19 crises, or being on the brink of a third world war. I think now is the time to really speak up, as the ground beneath us is almost shifting and the discourse is shifting across the globe. So to come back to your question, I don't think I'm a rare breed in terms of how I am with patients. I think a lot of my colleagues are, certainly, when we talk about these things. We just have to be louder, and we just have to talk about these things. We have so much, as clinicians, we have so much social power, more than we think we do.
You do. Because what you tell someone like me, a patient, I mean, I no longer see myself as a patient. That's not part of my identity, but just for the convenience sake, say, yes, patient. If somebody tells me how things will be with my pain, it depends who tells me this story. And you, Sanya, and Mick, with your knowledge and with your status, should I say, or title, it means it weighs much more than somebody down the street tells me something exactly the same sentence. So language matters. What you say really matters. The way we say to each other matters, because language in itself is a reflection. It's the aftermath of our ethics, our consciousness, and our thoughts. These are there already before it comes out through words. What you tell us definitely matters. Yeah. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, loads of thoughts come up, but I think, yeah, there's a huge responsibility, but a huge privilege of being somebody who's either trying to find out and investigate the science of this really complex experience that we call pain. There's a privilege in helping someone to manage and their own experience of pain. And I very much choose that intentionally, the words. It's actually working with somebody, not on someone, or doing something to someone. This is really important. Language-wise, there is a problem with language. We've got a problem for them, in my opinion, and I'd love your thoughts, Sonia, on this. We've worked through a medical model which was sort of dominant, probably still the dominant model really, when Malzahn put together the McGill Pain Questionnaire. But he and many others were part of this revolution that became the biopsychosocial approach. But what it's meant is that if you can justify, or even just say without any justification, I'm managing people within a biopsychosocial framework, that's almost a tick. Now that's language. It's the use of words to describe what you're doing. But actually, are you doing what is the fundamental principles and the ethics that are contained within that label of biopsychosocial medicine? And many of us now believe, most people who say that's the approach they're using, they have every justification and right to say that they are, but are they truly getting to the very ethic and to the practice that approach was trying to develop and produce? We would say no, they're not. And that's shifted us to, again, a different language, but that's okay, you know, and then we have to do the same thing within that remit, you know, as we were talking, or as you were talking, Sonia, I've added another E. So as a modern approach within sort of where the philosophy and the modern approaches to pain management and other types of medicine have come in, is a sort of we've had the 3 E's in activism, embodiment, extended approaches. Then we went to the 4 E's, which included engaged. And then we've even had the sort of 5th E, which is sort of, you know, engagement. And maybe now what we can have is a 6th or 7th E, an empowerment. And as we add more of these things, rather than just adding words, what does that mean? And how do we have to put that into practice? What does it mean for practice? What would the empowerment look like? Empowering clinicians, empowering the person in pain. What would that look like? And I mean, you asked that question, Eugenie, and we probably haven't answered that. But let's put that on the table. Let's have that in the agenda. And if we, you know, if we can think of any other E's, let's put them there, not just because they're words, but let's try and understand what it means. What's the implication? Then how do we live by it? What does that really put across? Maybe, you know, I've already added another E, haven't I, in ethics? You know, what is the ethics about what we're doing, how we think, how we practice, what we say, you know? Yeah, people like us are listened to by other people. That's a real privilege, but it comes with a huge sort of pressure as well. And back to that point, we are humans, and sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. But we've got to be slowly, as we're scientists, trying to get it more right than more wrong.
I'll tell you a story. I think I told you this before, but not many audience have heard this from me. That empowerment, it's a very short story, but incredibly powerful to me. And when I just started my residency to work at Body and Mind, Professor James McCauley was there. We were just sitting there having a talk just over lunch, and I didn't really know him. He didn't really know me, but he knew that I was living with pain. And we were just chatting, and then he just suddenly looked at me and said, "You're going to get better." Yeah, I know. And then turned around and continued conversation, some other random thing I don't remember. But that sentence stuck with me, and really that was my turning point for me to be a person living with pain, to thrive. I don't see myself as somebody who just functions. I'm a person who thrives with my pain experience, with everything else, with my all intersectionality that contributes to who I am as a person. That sentence, because who he was, and that empowerment, what he said was life-changing.
Yeah.
And I say, every one of you, Mick and Sanya, you have that power to change somebody's life with single sentence.
Sorry, Eugenia, I came in there because I'm sure, Sonia, you'd recognize this within the world of pain management. He would probably be criticized for saying that to you in lots of places. You know, incredibly elite places in terms of their influence on the way that pain is managed would give a message that they're not about getting you better. They're about helping you to cope with what you've got. So they may argue, therefore, that they will be helping you to thrive because they're helping you to do more with the experience of pain, you know, once you've still got the same experience of pain. You know, one of James and my own colleague, Lorimer Mosley, and myself have defended the idea that it's unbiological to suggest that actually if you are helping someone, pain will not lessen, your experience will not lessen. It is unbiological. And we think about pain 90% in the same way, but 10% very differently from one another these days. But, you know, very good friends, I'm pleased to say. But you know, there is a very definite message that people shouldn't be telling you you'll get better, or your pain will go away, or your pain will lessen. I don't know, Sonia, whether I may now be out of date and that's stopped completely in the clinical setting, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I just wanna step in. It's to do with the context. So in a context, my husband tells me, yeah, you better. That actually makes me feel worse. But in that context, when James said that to me, it was different. Sanya, your turn. Sorry. Yeah.
Absolutely. It sounds like he really saw you. I know, Mick, I have a huge issue with this whole idea of like flourishing alongside pain and living well alongside pain. And, you know, and the question behind this ethical question is, who are we privileging by saying those things to people? And what do we know? How will this person move throughout the journey? What do we know? You know, what human spirit is capable of? I really don't like that phrase, and especially because I work in this very deprived part of the country, where people are not only medically marginalized for having chronic pain, but they are also socially vulnerable and at risk because of all these, you know, housing issues, poor health literacy, poverty. And so this idea of like flourishing alongside pain, it doesn't make sense to me, because some people are actually living beneath the basic level of human dignity. And to kind of add also to what you were saying, Mick, about how does this look in actual practice? How does this look in action? You know, I'm really interested in that. I'm not interested in fancy words on a paper. Social justice is not a buzzword in a research paper. It's actually it's a hard work on the ground with ordinary folks. So this is what I am interested in, and I want to see. Clinicians should be having more time to work with patients, and we should really ask for that and really make a noise. I think we should be creating more collaboration, kinship collaboration with social services, because currently this biopsychosocial idea is really not happening in practice. We are paying the lip service to the social because medical system is not talking to the social support services. We need to be talking to each other actively, encouraging the conversation. And again, there is no manual how to do this. I have a million thoughts in my head right now. I just wanted to add to what you mentioned, Eugenie, about the role of art. This is where I think art plays a role, because art inspires us to imagine. And imagination is not some kind of escapism into a nicer future. Imagination is an act of survival and is a driving force for change. So to be able to reimagine means, okay, let's see what's going on, where the problems are, let's do analysis of that, and then let's find sources of hope, and then let's connect, and let's build communities, and let's kind of, you know, move forward. But art is inspiring us to reimagine. This is why I think we need art. We need artists. There's nothing to do with elitist. Art is social justice.
Yeah, I just read a Q&A here. Helena, she asked something very similar to what you're saying, Sanya. Please, could you discuss the role of offering hope in the clinical encounter? I wonder, Helena, if something like Sanya said, art is this a possibility for you? Somehow incorporate art. I mean, the way that Sanya and I'm talking about art is not just anything, just something fluffy, something unreachable, something out there. It is as a real tool, something that can offer a real substance.
I don't think really that hope can be, I don't think offer is the right word, offering hope. I think hope, it depends what hope looks like, really. There are many different versions of hope. I think it's about co-constructing and co-creating that hope.
with that person living with pain, what that hope would look like to that person, what would that mean to that person.
And I think when you say that, Eugenia, what's really important is these are often questions that are just steered away from. You know, that's not, again, back to my point about whose remit, which professional group has a remit to discuss hope. You know, who was trained in hope where, you know, during their sort of undergrad days, you know, I've got no idea if it was ever discussed on my course, probably because I didn't listen most of the time, but I'm pretty confident it wasn't, you know. So how do we work on hope? How do we work with people to engage with all the necessary pieces of information, activities, etc. in that person's sort of life to help them to achieve hope for themselves? But I think, you know, maybe my simple answer would be, again, art, writing, you know. But again, I also, as a lad who grew up in the very landscape, Sonia, you sort of work in, I think I explained to both of you, you know, and for some of the listeners, because people and viewers, people were from all around the globe. I mean, you know, might surprise people to understand that people in the UK live in poverty, you know, true poverty, you know. And I don't think you should compare poverty across the globe. Poverty is poverty in the place where poverty is observed. But most of the people I grew up with in my area couldn't read and write. In fact, my granddad was one of the few people in his area who could read and write. And that's in the very place where you work, Sonia, eh? And he got by because he sort of was quite political and he wasn't able to work. He literally brought up 13 kids by reading and writing for people so that they were given a voice when they wouldn't be able to have their own voice normally. You know, and he gave people, you know, it's often said he gave people hope, but, you know, I don't think he ever thought he was giving anyone a hope. He was just doing what they needed to achieve that for themselves. And I think, you know, that really resonates, particularly because the way you're working and the people you're working with. You know, what did hope look like for them? It may have been, you know, being able to feed their kids the next day, you know.
Yeah.
I
love what you just did, where you kind of expressed your social privileges and penalties and that humility. And I think when we work in that, like, I come from a working class background, but my education was very middle class. So I'm a white woman with a middle class education. I enjoy many privileges of the society. But when I entered the social field of Lincolnshire, a lot of my childhood stories and the way I was brought up came up in me. So this idea of like dealing with my own biases and encountering that humility within me, so I can then walk alongside this person, then maybe we can find hope together. I don't think I've ever seen myself as offering hope as much as, well, maybe somewhere on that journey we can find it. And what does that look like? Yeah,
I agree. It would be impossible it would be unrealistic to expect somebody to take hold of, give control over. My life and my pain belongs to me, and it's under, how would I say it? It belongs to me, that I manage it and I deal with it. But sometimes I just get a little bit confused. So I just need to talk it out. And that person just needs to hear me. And if things are a bit jumbled up in my head, all I expect is for that person to sort of untangle things in me sometimes. Because I'm the one who need to take this body and this mind, thoughts, all of it with me outside of the clinical 15 minutes consultation. And I got to carry out my life. And that's all I expect. So what you said, Sanya, I think it really is true in a sense that walk alongside that person, just walk along one step at a time together. I think it takes two parties to be able to just work things out,
Yeah,
if
and I
that
think
makes sense.
so. Eugene, I'm to come back in there because I, you know, where Hal and I that we either owe you an apology or we don't owe you an apology. I hope we don't owe you an apology, but yeah, for your brevity, I've just picked up your second thing. You know, you're trying to be brief, and we should appreciate that. And you raised a very important point about hope within clinicians. You know, and I hope that's emerging from what Sonia said. That, you know, look, you know, we no, none of us, although we could make criticisms of clinical experiences we've had, both as clinicians observing other clinicians, Eugenie's case observing, you know, clinicians working with her. I might even say from some of the insights we've got about your own experience, Eugenie, on you, to you, whatever, you know, or that's the thinking. You know, we need to raise hope in clinicians, and there's a couple of other questions that say, yeah, you know, how do we almost re-educate clinicians or make what they understand, you know, be able to really get at this point where we're able to cure people. I think cure is not, because one of the questioners uses it as a terrible word, but it's just a really difficult word. What does cure mean, you know? And also, do you really want to take the experiences that come from many people who are experiencing pain totally away? You know, there's some things that, and Eugenie, you know, I've heard you speak on this before, but, you know, it's always an option whether you want to speak to that or not in any of these sort of forums, whether, you know, you actually gain something positively by the experiences you've had whilst you've been experiencing pain. How has it changed your life? Or does it do, you know, that this sort of idea of cure is to eradicate everything. And, you know, there's no benefit to having a pain experience at all, ever, in any situation. So I think, you know, we bring it up, but, you know, my own interest in this thing called predictive processing is to try and make sense of actually all these different factors that could result in a pain experience, and therefore maybe give us some insights about what areas we need to address to try and help people to not only understand, but to be able to act in such a way within their lived world that is likely to mean that the resultant processing throughout their nervous system is not resulting in the best or most likely conclusion for their whole physiology to now give them a pain experience. And I've probably sort of just thrown lots of words at that, but what we believe in that sort of framework is that multitude of factors are constantly being evaluated to give you, if you like, the best inference about what you're experiencing. So if we can change any of those factors in such a way that would change the inference so that you no longer are threatened or have a construct of damage or, you know, a sense of loss of agency, which was mentioned before, then those things are biologically and not just theoretically likely to reduce the person's experience of pain. So I've thrown loads of stuff together there, and, you know, but I hope, you know, that gives some hope that we can change different things. But it would be wrong to just try and change someone's physiology without trying to deal with the social constructs. And I think that emerges from that particular framework as well. You know, it forces you to engage with true, in my mind, true biopsychosocial approaches, you know, but we maybe need better terms.
Yeah. I just read this last sentence here, that clinicians also feel they have lost a voice in the system. You just humanized the system to me. And for me to hear that from you, something like those sentences really make my management, somehow my pain management, so much better, because I'm seeing you as a human. I don't have answer for your question, but but I'm seeing you as a human. Then that makes a whole lot of difference.
I think, Sonia, your point, I mean, you know, maybe we are, maybe you and I, as the clinicians represented here, are a poor representation, because we both actually acknowledge our working class background and proud of that, but also acknowledge the fact we now live privileged middle class lives, you know, and have been educated through a system dominated by middle class sort of academic thinking, you know, but we hopefully retain some sense of identity that relates back to having observed, lived through poverty. And I know, you know, your own experience of growing up in a country that experienced war, you know, must give you incredible insights as a clinician. And many clinicians you now work with in the sort of safe environments of Lincolnshire, relatively safe environments from a war point of view, you know, that they'll never have seen those things, you know. Yeah, it's easy to not be political, and it's also easy to be very political depending on your experiences. But I don't think I've still heard within the UK a real powerful lobby from clinicians and clinical representative groups. You know, my own is called the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy. You know, not to be too political, but the patron of that is the Queen. You know, it's unlikely that any group that has the highest figurehead of a classist system within our society is likely to create the sort of disruption that is required to make a significant change. We have the Royal College of Surgeons, we have the Royal College of Physicians. All of these things owe patronage to, you know, within a system that is dominated in the UK, where I live and where Sonia works, which is a highly classist society. And it's unlikely that those bodies that govern clinical professions are prepared to really do very much beyond a certain point. Yeah, they have a voice, they speak out on topics, but also within the sort of wider world. And sure, it's the case in much places outside of medicine, being a doctor or nursing. You know, most other professions are somehow grouped into one of those, often terribly based on whether you're a man or a woman. You know, if you're a man, you're thought of as a medic. If you're a female, you're thought of as a nurse, you know. So if you're a dietitian, if you're a speech and language therapist, if you're an occupational therapist, you're a clinical psychologist, an art therapist, and the list could go on, osteopath, chiropractor. You know, that those professions are often not even seen by the wider media, by the wider system. They're put into a subgroup of medicine or a subgroup of nursing. You know, and many of those other groups now are the most responsible professions for managing pain, oddly enough. So, you know, they don't have a powerful voice, and they're the ones managing the voiceless. You know, so it adds to voicelessness, if that's in fact a word.
If I might step in, just very briefly to suggest if we could just have the final thoughts from the three speakers, because I think you've kind of addressed several of the questions that have come up in the chat. So maybe I can, sorry Sonia for interrupting you, but maybe we could start with you and just sort of have your final thoughts as we bring the session to a close.
Thank you. I kind of wanted to say that I don't want to say anything because I think this is such a beautiful conclusion that Mick said, and I just want to agree with him. And I just want to also partly answer to Helena's question about hope. What makes us hopeful? This makes me hopeful. Having this, being in dialogue with you makes me hopeful, and I hope that you feel the same. That's where I want to leave it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the whole intention of us having this such a big question within 1 hour talk is just so that we can plant the seeds in people who are listening to this talk, so that we can start thinking about things. It's just there as a provocation, and everything starts from the seed. And I hope that we have planted the seed in a right way for a lot of you to start thinking about a real meaningful positive future for us all. And yeah, thank you very much for everyone listening to our talk. Mick, do you have a final say?
I think for me, it's the word privilege. It's always been a privilege for me to share ideas with people like yourself, but it's also a privilege to be able to help manage and be part of the life of people who are experiencing this thing that we happen to be fascinated by. So, often I hear sports people say, well, being a professional sportsman is one of the biggest privileges. I get to go to work every day to do what I really enjoy. And it sounds odd to sort of say, well, I really enjoy pain, but it's the enjoyment comes from that privilege, the privilege to be able to listen to people and their stories, to try and help in some way, but also to be able to sort of be part of their life and hopefully have some positive impact on that. That's a real privilege. And it's a privilege to be able to sort of, study a topic which is fascinating, but also hopefully is about trying to always find something that is going to help people. I mentioned Pat Wall earlier. He will always be a massive part of my life, and he was one of the God people of the pain world. He always said, if you're not interested in people's experience, then you're not interested in pain.
Well said.
Thank you so much, Mick, Eugenie, and Sanya. This was really brilliant, and especially those last thoughts. I think the lecture really, the session dove into several interesting questions. It probably left people with many things to continue thinking about. And like you said, Eugenie, this is just the seeds to begin this conversation more in depth. So again, thank you everyone who took the time out to join us today for this session. It was a pleasure having you here. I would like to encourage you to see Eugenie's exhibit at Psyche, the McGill Pain Questionnaire. The link is in the chat, so please do have a look at it. I think it will resonate even more now after this discussion. And if you're interested, we have a talk next week, which is Reimagining the Path to Recovery, which is by psychiatrist Vikram Patel, where he's talking about how we might reimagine the healthcare system, particularly mental health care in India, by empowering the community. So do join us for that on the final day of Psyche. That's on the 15th of May. And please do share your feedback about today's session. The link to the feedback form is in the chat. So please do share your thoughts about today's session and tell us what we could do better going forward. Once again, thank you so much, Eugenie, Mick, and Sanya for joining us this afternoon. And thank you everyone else for attending as well.